Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the ReluTech Podcast. I am glad to have a repeat guest here, Arun Krishnakumar. This is actually his first time coming back on since we rebranded the Nerd Rabbit Podcast to the ReluTech Podcast, so I'm glad to have him here. Welcome, Arun. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Chris. Nice to meet everyone. Happy New Year to all. Hopefully, this year have a great start. I'm happy to be in the podcast.
Yeah. Well, Arun has been a pretty steady user on the Nerd Rabbit platform for a few years now. He's Rabbit633 there if you're ever looking for any sort of cloud help. He's done a few of our podcasts in the past. We often dig into pretty specific topics in the AWS space to explore those topics, talk about some use cases, why customers might be interested, and then just kind of how people can work through some of these questions they might have with different cloud services. So today we are going to be talking about Microsoft Entra, but specifically Microsoft Entra on AWS. So a lot of people out there maybe work on a Microsoft technology stack, .NET, SQL Server, all that fun stuff, and maybe have had hesitations towards looking at AWS as a cloud platform because, Microsoft has Azure and you're not sure if AWS is going to have the kind of compatibility you need. And more or less this conversation to put some of those fears to rest. AWS has been at this for a little while in the public cloud game, probably longer than everybody else. And needless to say, they were very aware from the start that Microsoft technology stacks were going to be workloads that needed to
Mm-hmm.
exist in their
Yep.
space. So we're going to dig a little bit into this. So the way we're going to frame this today is through a few use cases. So when we were talking about this earlier, we noticed there's a lot of different use cases for Microsoft Entra being an identity and access management platform. So we want to talk about some common ones that Arun sees with customers, things that people are trying to work through when implementing Microsoft Entra on their platform, what we can get done and what are the benefits of the implementations here. So we're going to pick a top three. We'll start with just the first one. What do you think is the most common use case that you see with Entra inside the AWS space?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Before that, I also want to give a few synopsis about Microsoft Air Entra. So Microsoft Entra is the new name for AAD, which is Azure Active Directory. And what is Azure Active Directory? Is the domain controller on the cloud. Microsoft Office 365, which is Microsoft 365 now, um, operates under hood. It has the domain controller. Okay, so the Microsoft stack, who are using Microsoft stack, there is like an easy path to migrate to Azure Active Directory, which is the Microsoft Entra for all of their services. Okay, so when it comes to AWS, so there is Microsoft already provides Azure, and it also provides the domain controller, and there can be like a straightaway question. Okay, if Microsoft has Azure stack, why do I want to go to AWS? That's a common question that I've been asked from customers. Okay, the answer is the use cases. There are like multiple use cases that can be targeted. And the first use case, like it's what is it, centralized identity management, Chris?
Yeah, so I think you were talking about centralized identity management for hybrid workloads.
Exactly. So consider the situation like where we have the workloads in AWS, but the Active Directory of the users is coming from Microsoft Entra. How do we enable the handshake? Because that's a very common scenario for having the centralized identity management. So we want to make sure, like, because AWS has its own like inbuilt Active Directory, but that doesn't provide the kind of flexibility that Microsoft Entra provides. So normally, what customers do is like they use Microsoft Entra for login, and then we can use that identities on AWS. Let's say we create servers and then attach to the domain controller. It's a little bit complicated setup, but it works seamlessly. For one of the client, we have implemented that kind of setup, and the client was super happy because they're able to use Microsoft Entra as an authentication system to log into the server on AWS.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's a lot of reasons you might want to have a server on AWS. It could be availability. It could be certain services that are provided there that are outside of the Microsoft stack. and the ability to leverage Entra to kind of make that connection and utilize your Microsoft stack while still authenticating and working inside the AWS space, it's appealing.
And the bigger benefit is kind of, let's say, like it's a simplified authentication for the application hosted on AWS, and there's a centralized user and a group management across Azure, so that a user like onboarded and the user offboarding, it's so easy. Okay, we can control everything from the domain. So that's one of the like a key feature for having the centralized identity management, and which is becoming more and more popular nowadays. Okay, because we have dealing with so many systems, so many services across multiple platforms. User management becomes a headache for customer when there is a lot of applications and tool sets available. So having this domain, especially like with Microsoft Entra, like releases that headache for us, to be honest.
Yeah, as it goes, when you're working on a lot of different applications, a lot of different users, a lot of different access and authentication, you don't want that to be disparate. You don't want to be looking in 1,000 different places so that the right people can do the right things. So this just streamlines that whole thing. Now, so
100%.
that's the centralization of identity management. What do you think is the next most common use case that you're seeing?
Um, Migration, okay, which is a pretty common use case, like migrating the legacy applications that uses Microsoft Entra as a kind of a way to authenticate the users. Uh, so that's a pretty common scenario. Let's say we have the application sitting on a data center which uses this Microsoft, let's say like Active Directory for their authentication as an authentication mechanism. We move the workloads to AWS and we want to have a handshake. So we go for Microsoft Entra and then do the handshake. There's a series of steps that we have to do as a more technical, but we can enable using the Microsoft Entra and then on the AWS to have like a very authenticated handshake, and we can do the migration process.
Yeah, I mean, naturally, when anyone's migrating something to the cloud, they don't want headaches for their users. They don't want any sort of inconsistency from when something goes live in that space. They want to make sure that every user continues to experience their applications as per
Uh,
usual.
Exactly. And the other key features is like we don't need to modify the existing code, so that already companies would have spent a lot of money on maintaining, writing the authentication
Oh,
service.
yeah.
So
This is
so
more
we
lift and shift. This is,
exactly lift and shift, and then just do modify the way how the systems talk to each other, like especially on the authentication handshake, and that's all. So the application works as it is. That's one of the key feature. Okay.
which I think that's big for a lot of customers because for one reason or another, maybe it's support on data center equipment, maybe it's a lot of things, but they might have a time frame moving to the cloud and they might not have time to refactor or replatform or all these other options that are available when you move to the cloud. They might need a lift and shift,
Exactly.
and you don't want complication and you don't want a lack of continuity for your users when you do that.
No, 100%. And then I also want to point out this, as part of this, there are customers that need, for example, on automate certain things. Okay, I have a Microsoft Teams. I want to send a notification to this channel. We can use Graph APIs that Microsoft, like it comes with as part of the Entra or Office 365 suite. Use the Graph APIs and then create automation on the AWS side, which is a cool thing. Okay, so I've done one set of invoice automations for one of the clients because they want to send the notification to Teams channel. It works very seamlessly.
Yeah, it's something that's designed to be easy. And again, the whole thing here is just because customers sometimes need something that's not going to be the most complicated approach, and Entra does a lot to offer that from an IAM standpoint. Now, last but not least, number three. What do you think's the number three most common?
It's again, it's a very common use case, especially let's say like a medium tier to large customers. Uh, I was working for the healthcare client and all, like, and again, the data in the healthcare client it's so sensitive. So normally they don't rely on particular one cloud provider. They rely on multiple cloud providers. Let's
Oh
say
yeah,
I've seen like they use Azure, AWS, and even GCP. Okay. So right now, let's say if I have my tech stack running on Azure, I want to create a DR strategy. and business continuity for the workloads that I'm doing. So I don't want to create a DR strategy on Azure because already workloads are running there. Okay, I want to have a DR strategy completely out of Azure. Now we have AWS in place. So in that case, I can have the workloads created in AWS and have the Microsoft Entra handshake.
So you're using different public cloud providers as the
Exactly.
disaster recovery plan for the
Yes.
other cloud provider.
On the cloud provider. Exactly, right? Because there are situations where we have seen Microsoft, like Azure services go down and also like AWS services go down, right? But apparently I have never seen like both services are going at the same time. Okay.
Yeah, they're completely operating independently at that time, and if both of them are down, it's probably for something pretty large scale. So let's hope that that never happens.
Yes,
Um,
so exactly, right. So that's like I've seen this situation pretty common. Like it could be vice versa. Like we have the workloads on AWS, they do the DR strategy in Azure, or they have the workloads running on Azure stack, and then they have the DR strategy in AWS. But similarly, the automations again, modern day like using Terraform, we can completely automate that piece as well. But this DR strategy on AWS integrating with Microsoft Entra, right? It's a very highly, I would say, like highly scalable and also like highly reliant way of approaching the DR strategy and disaster recovery and business continuity.
yeah, it's something interesting just because, each of these cloud providers, they have various regions and different data centers that you can use those for disaster recovery, and they're pretty reliable to say the least. But again, maybe there's something more systemic in a system you're using from one of the providers that you can be assisted with by having disaster recovery outside of that provider. So just for companies that want to make sure that they have crossed every T and dotted every I, like a healthcare company or a financial company, this kind of stuff can be really beneficial and
Yes,
straightforward.
it is.
Um,
It is 100%
now,
is.
we've been talking before this, and the thing was we had a lot of other use cases we were going through. Microsoft Entra can play some roles, whether it be secure remote desktop services in AWS, multi-cloud identity federation, application modernization. So if you do have further questions, reach out to Arun Krishnakumar. He is Rabbit633 on the Nerd Rabbit platform. But the whole point today was more to get into that some of these Microsoft tools that are available not only are very functional in the AWS space, but can be used in a way there to really leverage the cloud in a way that you wouldn't be able to get from one provider or the other. It's kind of a diversification strategy, it sounds like.
100%. So and again, it's Microsoft Entra is kind of maturing. I would say like in a way from where they started, where they are right now. And one of the key feature where customers and everyone, I think the whole industry is facing is about like centralized authentication and enhanced security. Okay,
Yeah.
right from a zero trust security architecture or anything you take, enhancing security it's to be the like a number one strategy for any kind of application or workloads that we are going to deploy in the cloud because like cybersecurity attacks and all of that, and then maintaining common user pool for authentication and authorization helps a lot actually.
Yeah, and for a lot of these users who are already in the Microsoft space using Active Directory, again, it's kind of that seamlessness, being able to move to the cloud with a similar security approach that you have implemented in the past. So, security is going to be the name of the game for everyone as the future keeps pressing forwards. We're seeing some pretty crazy technology that is making security a trickier and trickier task, but luckily we keep seeing new technology that also seems up to the task of beating it. So, Arun, again, it's always a pleasure having you on the podcast. And until next time, we're going to have Arun on here for a few different series this year, just talking
Yeah.
about different topics in the cloud, whether it be AWS, Azure, and making sure that we can just keep informing people on the different tools that are available to help them with their problems. So thanks again, Arun.
No problem. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.